For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. And I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, but I never thought I'd be doing this. I went to Columbia for undergrad, so I went to an Ivy League. I thought I was going to go to a top 14 law school. And I always thought I'd been good at standardized tests. But the LSAT was just this one exam I could not crack. I took exam after exam, but my scores stayed in the low 150s. And to put that in context, the average LSAT score is about a 151. So my starting point was pretty average. And like most people, I would take exam after exam after exam. I would measure my results obsessively. I would track them with spreadsheets and charts, and I'd be happy or sad about those results. And then I would just move on to the next exam. And I call this the obsessive practice exam narrative. And I see this at play with a lot of students I work with over the years. It's kind of a default course of action because there are nearly 100 released LSAT exams, and most of them are numbered. So a lot of folks get the idea, I'll just start with exam number 1 and work my way up from there. Or I'll start with exam number 50 and work my way up from there. I was talking with a student earlier today, actually, who told me he had done 50 released LSAT exams, and he would just go through them in order. And his scores hadn't really budged too much. So I said to him, why do you keep doing the same thing over and over? It's not working. And he said, because I don't know what else to do. And the problem with this is that it leads to burnout. Burnout is one of those things where you have been studying for a while, you're putting in a lot of work, almost too much work, and your scores start dropping. And it's not because you're getting dumber, it's because you've just fatigued yourself. You reach the point where you're so sick of this exam, you couldn't bear to look at it, but you also can't look away from it because you know just how important it is. And so I faced both of those things. I personally suffered from this obsessive practice exam narrative, doing exam after exam. I did every single exam ever released. I used every single LSAT prep book I could find. Even the bad ones, even the ones with fake LSAT questions that contained mistakes. I just didn't know what else to do. And I finally figured it out. It took me an entire year, but I very gradually raised my score from a 152 starting point to a 175. And to put that in context, most LSAT prep companies claim an average score increase of 10 to 11 points. I increased 23 points. And I want to share with you tonight some of the insights I gained from my journey in the hopes that it will help you avoid some of these common pitfalls. We're going to talk about laser. We're going to talk about the practice test rule. We're going to talk about the law of averages. And most importantly, we're going to talk about the Socratic review method. I said tonight that we're going to focus on question review strategies, specifically because these are the things that you need to be applying to your prep. LASER is an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. And this is the framework underlying my LSAT study plans. Most people leave off the R in laser and end up with LASE, or as I like to call it, lazy, because you are being lazy if you are neglecting the most important aspect of prep, which is review. And I understand why. It's because reviewing sucks. It's really hard. It's really boring. And there's nothing that can make you feel worse than dwelling on your mistakes, dwelling on where you went wrong, where you failed to choose the correct answer and you fell for a trap or trick that the test makers purposely laid out for you. But it's really important because if you don't learn from your mistakes, of course, you're doomed to keep making them again and again and again. I'm actually friends with a guy who used to write actual official LSAT questions. I've done a few discussions with him on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I also have a book of interviews with him as well on my site, the LSAT blog. And he told me that they purposely place traps in questions. And he kind of giggled with glee when he described some of the answer choices he had put in there to mislead students who weren't thinking carefully enough. And we'll talk about some of those common tricks and traps they use. And it's really important for you to figure out which specific traps you are most uniquely prone to falling for so that you won't keep making the same mistakes again. Because you're not falling for every single mistake out there, or else you'd be getting a 120. You're only falling for certain specific mistakes. But the thing is that the exams repeat themselves. There are nearly 100 released exams, and you could do all of them. And if you're studying for a year or more, you might want to do all of them. But if your timeline is 2 to 3 months from now, or even 6 months from now, you might want to focus on just a couple dozen of the most recent exams. You don't need to go back to exam number 1, because even within a set of 10 or 20 exams, you will be exposed to a wide enough variety of the question types and the tricks that LSAT uses, such that you don't need to go beyond that. I would rather you do 10 exams in excruciating detail with your review than do 50, but only engage in a cursory or surface level review. So let's start by talking about LASER, which is the framework underlying my LSAT study plans. LASER, once again, is an acronym standing for Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. Once again, Learning, Accuracy, Sections, Exams, and Review. Learning is theory, basically building the foundation first, reading textbooks, watching videos, gaining a basic familiarity with what's covered on the exam. So logic games, you have ordering games and grouping games. Logical reasoning, you have strengthen questions, weaken questions, must be true, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, and of course, many, many others. Just getting a sense of what this exam involves. Then A is for accuracy, where you focus specifically and exclusively on accuracy, doing questions by type, to see the common trends in how necessary assumption questions differ from sufficient assumption questions. For example, the proper perspective from which to view a question, given the question stem, and also, of course, the various methods of reasoning involved on the LSAT. That's an important phase. Then S is for sections, doing individual timed 35-minute sections to get your pacing down, to figure out how to allocate your time over the course of that 35-minute section. You have 4 games in 35 minutes, but not all games should be completed in exactly 8 minutes and 45 seconds, which is the average amount of time if you were to divide it evenly. Rather, some games are easier than others. Some games might take 12 minutes. Other games, you might want to speed through them in 6 minutes. And with the right techniques, you can. For logical reasoning, questions are presented in a general order of difficulty. So you may want to do the first 10 questions in about 10 to 12 minutes to build up a time bank to do the tougher questions later in the section with more time. So those are just some examples. Then E is for exams and endurance, doing full-length 5-section exams because, face it, it's really grueling to do nothing but LSAT questions for a solid 3 hours. It's a lot of work, but it's really important work. And so you want to take time to figure out how can you treat this exam as a marathon, not a sprint, and save some gas for the end. You do get a break in the middle, but it's still really grueling. Even I'm fried after a full-length 5-section exam. So you want to do several of those in the lead up to test day. I recommend a minimum of 10. And then finally, of course, R is for review. And that is the most important but most often neglected aspect of prep. And we'll talk about the Socratic review method in a little bit. I want to talk about the prep test, my practice test rule. This is basically to help you avoid burnout, to help you avoid doing too much, to help you avoid that obsessive practice exam narrative where you're doing exam after exam. I recommend maximum 2 tests per week and a minimum of 2 hours reviewing each test. Again, max 2 tests per week, minimum 2 hours reviewing each test. The reason for this is that it's a lot of work to take an exam. Again, 3 hours, grueling, marathon. Then reviewing those exams is also a lot of work. Think about it. Let's say you got a 170, which is awesome, and only about 3% of students actually get 170 or above. But if you did hypothetically on a practice test, that means you got about 10 questions wrong. You got 10 wrong, but there were also maybe another 10 to 15 that you guessed on, weren't sure about, not 100% on them, but you guessed and got lucky. Maybe you were down to 2 choices and you guessed right. Others you get wrong. You shouldn't only review the ones you get wrong. You should also review the ones you get right, because it just as easily could have gone the other way the next time around. So you got to slow down and take the time. The 10 that you got wrong, plus the 10 to 15 that you guessed on, that's 20, 25 questions. And even spending, let's say, 5 minutes per question you got wrong, that's already a couple of hours. And if you're working, if you're in school, if you have family obligations, any of that, 3 hours for an exam, 3 hours for review at least, twice per week, that's already 12 hours of study and maybe more. Then also, if you're working on weak areas, shoring up your foundation in any areas that you need to, reading textbooks, watching videos, listening to podcasts, it all takes a lot of time. So could you do 3 exams per week plus another 6 hours of reviewing for those exams altogether? That's a lot. So max 2 tests per week, minimum 2 hours of reviewing each test. There are exceptions, of course. If you're studying full-time and have no other obligations and you haven't done enough exams, maybe it's worth taking the time to do a little bit more, but generally 2 is enough. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Socratic review method and what this involves. I derived this from, for those of you familiar with business and any of you have an MBA, the 5 whys, Kaizen, 6 Sigma. If you haven't heard of any of those, don't worry. The idea is getting to the root cause of a problem, to keep asking why, you got something wrong, to keep asking why you had trouble with something, to figure out where your misunderstanding stemmed from. So there are 3 areas to analyze here: the stimulus, the question stem, and the answer choices. I will speak specifically about logical reasoning here, but a lot of this applies to reading comp as well. Logic is a bit different. I'll get into that in a bit. So again, stimulus, question stem, answer choices. If your misunderstanding came from the stimulus, you got to figure out what it was about the stimulus that gave you trouble. Was it the argument? Was it the method of reasoning? Was it the topic? Was it the lack of indicator words? Or were there confusing indicator words for either evidence and conclusion, or sufficient and necessary if we're dealing with conditional statements here and conditional logic? Maybe we have those annoying words like unless, except, until, or without. Maybe the conclusion was buried in the middle. Maybe it was surrounded by filler. Maybe there were counter premises. Maybe there were conditional statements that you had to take the contrapositive in order to link things together smoothly. There are a lot of things that could have confused you about the stimulus, and you've got to figure out why. And if it is, for example, things like unless, except, until, and without, you can drill that. You can figure that out. That is an issue that you can resolve. But it takes slowing down and figuring out why it gave you trouble in order to figure out what you've got to work on, to figure out what your weak area is and what you've got to look up in order to figure it out. Maybe you got to Google an explanation for something, but you got to slow down and figure that out rather than simply looking at the correct answer or looking at an explanation, saying, I get it now, and moving on. Figure out what your fundamentals, where your fundamentals were lacking, and start there. Then if your issue was with the question stem, maybe it's because the question stem was confusingly worded. LSAC loves to present familiar concepts in unfamiliar ways. And if they're describing a flaw question in a confusing way, you got to figure out, oh, that turns out that was actually simply a flaw question and nothing more. They were using an unfamiliar synonym or unfamiliar phrase. But now I've got it and I won't make the same mistake again. Or if it was maybe necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption, 2 completely separate question types that are often conflated. Students often confuse the 2. But it's really important to have a proper sense of what the difference is and how to recognize each one, because they require completely different perspectives. Now, the answer choices. This is where a lot of the tricks and traps fall, especially in reading comprehension. They are great at making an answer half right and half wrong, but it turns out half wrong is all wrong. And reading comp more than any other section, it's important to look at process of elimination. And you've got to figure out, if you make a mistake, what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it, and what ultimately makes it wrong, and what was discouraging about the right answer that pushed you away from it and made it unappealing, and what ultimately makes it correct in the end. So you have these traps of encouragement towards wrong answer choices and traps of discouragement away from the correct answer. And you've got to slow down and figure it out which of those tricks and traps you were falling for, so that you can avoid making the same mistake again. And again, if you just look at the correct answer or you just look at some explanation online, even mine, you are using it too much as a crutch. Instead, you've got to first puzzle through it on your own, really grapple with it. And again, this is the work. If it were easy, more people would do it and more people would get top scores. The fact that it's hard tells you there is something valuable to be gained from doing this work. So grapple with it. Don't just do it all in your head. Articulate it. You got to speak it out or write it out. You could talk it out with a friend or a coach or a tutor or a study buddy, or even post about it online. But articulate it, or keep a mistake journal, either in a Google Doc or a Moleskine notebook or a bullet journal of some kind. It's really important to keep a running list of these so that you can return to them time and again and see a week later, a month later, 3 months later, would you make that same mistake again? Now, I have an example here I will share with you in the chat of what one student did to articulate their thought process. So I'll share the links with you here if you want to take a look at one example of what this could look like. And this is not the most perfect student written explanation ever. I just like to use it because it's realistic. I could actually see any one of you in this group tonight using this technique and writing something similar for yourself. It takes time, takes work, and if you're doing it for 20, 25 questions, that will take several hours. So you don't need to actually write it out for every single one, but for the questions that gave you the most trouble, it is absolutely worth taking the time. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about logic games and how to review there, because there the process is a little bit different. For logic games, of course, you don't have the ambiguities of language that you have in logical reasoning and reading comprehension. So for logic games, the simplest technique is, of course, to redo them and then to look at a variety of explanations to see how different minds solve it, because there is not only one way to solve any logic game. You look at 5 different explanations, you'll see 5 different techniques, and they're all valid, but one might speak to you more than another. I've created explanations for the vast majority of logic games on the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel, where I actually walk through with a whiteboard how I would solve them. But my way is not the only way, nor is it necessarily the perfect way. Some folks will say to me sometimes, I like my way better than the way that you explain it. And I say, great, I'm really glad that you've developed a totally different technique. Totally fine. There are many different valid ways to solve these. would never say, how dare you? There's not only one way, there's many different ways, and some ways are more efficient than others. You've also got to keep in mind that when you look at an explanation, either mine or someone else's, we have the benefit of years of experience doing this at this point. I've been teaching this since 2005, and I look back at my old notes from back when I was studying, and I made so many of the same common mistakes I see students making today, like reversing necessary and sufficient conditions when there are confusing indicator words. I did these mistakes too, and I see students do these mistakes every single day. So if you're getting it wrong, you are not alone. You only feel that way because you may not know a lot of other students doing that exact problem at that exact moment in time. A couple of things you want to look for when you're reviewing games to get better at them. You want to look to see, can you make more upfront inferences? So could you look at the rules and combine them to make deductions or inferences before moving on to the questions? Most games have something you could do up front that will pave the way for you to solve the questions more efficiently over the course of the game. You won't necessarily see all inferences all the time. I personally don't either. But if you have 4 games in a section, maybe you'll solve 2 of the games super efficiently, and that will save you the time to solve the other games in the section a little bit less efficiently, and that's okay. You don't have to solve all of them perfectly efficiently all the time. But what you do want to avoid is having to brute force the question, which means that you're just trying out all 5 answer choices slowly, one by one, drawing out 5 different diagrams. That is inefficient, and there is pretty much always a better way to solve the question than that. You also want to look to see, could you have made better use of previous work, previous hypothetical scenarios? For most global, general, must-be-true questions in a game, there is previous work that you could use to help you solve that question more efficiently. You typically have the correct answer to your orientation question in that game, the one that asks you which one of the following is a valid hypothetical scenario. So that is a valid scenario that you can use over the course of the game. Then if you draw any diagrams for local if questions, those are valid scenarios you can use then later also. So I will sometimes recommend completing the questions in the game out of order, where you do the orientation question first, then the local questions, then the global questions. So you might want to try that out. Then you also want to see, when you're reviewing, if there is a way you could have better understood the rule. If there is some confusingly worded rule, you've got to slow down and take the time to understand it, because otherwise you can't solve the game properly. Solving any game requires a full understanding of all of the rules. So if you glossed over something on your first attempt, you've got to slow down upon your review and figure out what exactly that rule meant. Now, I heard from a student recently who got a 167 on her test in January. She was practice testing in the 170s, but she never reviewed in the ways that I'm describing tonight. And so she asked me, should she retake? And my answer is emphatically yes. If you have not been reviewing, you have not reached your fullest potential. So it is worth retaking. I've seen students improve 10 or more points on a retake. And that's after they had already improved from their baseline after building a basic familiarity with the various sections and question types on this exam. And there's a retake paradox I noticed where students on average, and this is from LSAT, they only improve an average of 2.8 points on a retake. So they're studying a ton for their retake, but barely improving. And you might say, why does that happen? And the answer is, I don't know. It varies from student to student, but even an average increase of 2.8, or let's just say 3 points, that is thousands of dollars in value to you, because the value of a single point on the LSAT is approximately $4,000 by one estimate. And that comes down to getting into a better law school or getting more scholarship money. And so improving only 3 points, that's $12,000. That's the easiest money you'll ever make. In the LSAT Unplugged Facebook community, I'll have students post about how much they improved and how much scholarship money they got as a result. And if you average it out, if you studied for 10 hours for a retake or even 100 hours for a retake, but you got $100,000 in scholarship money, that is a ton of value in study time per hour. That's the easiest money you'll ever make. So it is well worth retaking if you think that you could do even just a little bit better. It's funny, but students don't want to sometimes because they say, I don't want to study for the LSAT for another couple months or even 1 month. I want to be done with it and move on. But if you look at the ROI over the course of your entire career, the value of getting into a better law school or getting more scholarship money, it's huge. And schools are so numbers driven when it comes to admissions with scholarship offers that even just a point or two more could make a huge difference. And if you don't believe me, talk to admissions officers, especially if you got waitlisted or if you got previously denied, and you ask them, what could I do differently to increase my odds of getting accepted or increase my odds of getting more scholarship money? The answer is retake. Get a higher LSAT score, come back to them with that new number. It'll help them because law schools suffer from what I call runt syndrome, rankings under numerical threshold. Law schools are desperately afraid of falling in the US News rankings because that's how schools are evaluated. That's how their reputations are evaluated. That's how everyone perceives them, is what number is their rank. And if your LSAT score is above their median, they have reason to accept you and they have reason to offer you more scholarship money because you'll improve their average. You'll improve their median. So it's worth it to them. Now, I've talked a lot now. I want to make sure that I've addressed any relevant questions to my conversation so far. So I'm going to take a moment to pause from what I've been talking about and see if there's anything I have not mentioned, and feel free to continue asking questions and I will do my best to get to them. Let's see, tips for self-studying. Well, I talked about the laser approach to LSAT studying, learning, accuracy, sections, exams, and review. I talked about my study plans. That's a great framework if you're looking for how to go about this. So definitely take a look at those if you have any questions about that. Isn't necessary to take a prep class for the LSAT, or should you just study on your own? Is it doable to study on your own? I would say it's not necessary to take a prep class. You could go it alone. I just wouldn't rely only on Khan Academy. I know a lot of folks use it because it's free, and I would certainly recommend if it's free, why not? Not much of a downside, but Khan Academy is not really a cohesive system to prep for the LSAT. It's more like a collection of LSAT questions and explanations. And they give you about 10 or 11 exams for free. LSAT has provided them to Khan Academy, and so I would certainly use them as a source of real LSAT questions, but I wouldn't limit myself to only those resources alone. And luckily, there are more free resources available to self-studiers than ever before. And of course, I've made my entire career over the past 15 years based upon providing as many free and low-cost resources available to students as possible to make it easier to self-study. So I have the study schedules I mentioned. I also have things like guides, cheat sheets, checklists, explanations, and such. And I also have the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. So plenty of resources out there to make it available to you, to make it easier to self-study. Now, When it comes to schedules and self-studying, a couple of things I could talk about. One is what I call the full-timer's dilemma. Students who are studying for the LSAT full-time, once again, run the risk of burnout, studying too much. So I recommend slowing down and blocking off time. And that applies to anyone studying, whether you're studying full-time or not. Blocking off time that's for study, blocking off time that's for self-care, and blocking off time for fun. So if you were studying for the LSAT full-time with no other obligations, you might study from 9 a.m. till 12 p.m., take a break for lunch, study again from 1 to 4, and that's it. You're done. You don't need to do anything else LSAT related. 6 hours is more than enough, and it may even be too much. Maybe you want to do 2.5-hour chunks or 2-hour chunks. One great technique I like is called the Pomodoro technique, which helps you alternate periods of work and periods of break so that you're not tempted by distractions like email, social media, your phone and such, but you also have time allotted for them so that you know your next break is always coming up at some point. Then, if you have the opposite problem where you have competing obligations, like you are working full-time or you're in school, that's really tough. I hear from students working full-time all the time, especially paralegals working long hours. And I'll tell them, try to tell your boss you can't do overtime. Tell them you got to be done with work by 5 or 5:30 or 6. Or if you just got to go to work every day and you have certain defined hours like 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, you might want to get to work early and find a conference room or a coffee shop nearby, bring your books, and knock out an hour before you start the workday. And then before you go home for the day, take another hour or two and study again in a conference room at a coffee shop nearby, because once you get home, all those competing obligations like family, roommates, significant others, distractions of all sorts are looming large, and it's hard for you to actually buckle down and get the work done. So I would recommend staying at work, getting there early, staying late to get your studying done then. Now, I want to share with you 3 LSAT mindsets around nerves and anxiety, one to avoid, one to adopt, and one that I think will transform the way you think about this exam. The first that I want you to avoid is thinking that the LSAT is the end-all, be-all. So many folks suffer from nerves and anxiety. I hear about it all the time, including a student today who was telling me that they were worried that they just suffer from it, that they get the sweaty palms, they get their heart racing, they don't know what to do. And I tell them, slow down and think about for a moment, what is the best and worst case scenario for you? You look back 3 to 5 years from now, what happens if the LSAT goes well for you when you take it? And what happens if the LSAT goes poorly for you if you take it? And the LSAT for him was, in this case, March 30th. So he has a bit of time. And I said, take some time and write it out. Think about it. And the good news is that the best case scenario is get into a top law school. Awesome, of course, and you're done. But worst case scenario, you can always retake. The LSAT as a whole is incredibly important, but no one particular LSAT test date will make or break you. So this is the second mindset, the one to adopt, that you always have a future opportunity. Law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores. They only take the highest LSAT score. And so you can always retake. If you're taking it in February or March or April or June, July, doesn't matter. And of course, you want to apply relatively earlier. So retaking may require waiting a cycle, but that's what I recommend, honestly. For any given admission cycle, I recommend that January be the last LSAT that you take. And so any of you thinking of February or March, of course, you could take those LSATs and still apply this cycle, but you will increase your odds of getting in, and you will increase the available scholarship money if you wait and apply in the fall instead. Of course, nobody ever wants to wait, but it's worth it. So take the mindset to slow down and always know that you can retake. And finally, the mindset that will transform you and transform your mindset is to know that learning the exam, learning the LSAT, it's not just about mastering this one test. Rather, it's changing your entire way of thinking, developing a critical and skeptical mindset where you do not take arguments at face value. You slow down, you question the assumptions, and you ask yourself, even if the evidence is true, how is it possible for the conclusion to not be true, to problematize the claims that are being presented to you? And to see the exam from the test maker's perspective, if you could do that, it would change how you look at the LSAT. It would also change the way that you reason altogether. It will make you a more critical and deliberate thinker, and those skills carry forward into law school and beyond. So rather than saying that this exam is stupid, it doesn't test anything important, Why do they even include it? Instead, if you could really come to appreciate the exam for what it is, to develop a love for it and an appreciation and respect for the complexity and the cleverness that goes into creating this exam, it will serve you tremendously. If you think about it, who does best on the exam? The people who hate it and think it tests nothing at all, or the people who see there is a benevolent intelligence at work in this exam? And personally, I respect it a lot. I've looked at all the other standardized tests. I used to teach a lot of them, like the SAT, the ACT, the GRE, the GMAT. None of them even comes close to the complexity of the LSAT. The LSAT is tougher than any of them. And if you want to see it for comparison, look at GMAT critical reasoning. It's like an easy version of LSAT logical reasoning. And the people who make this exam, they are smart as hell. You know, the guy I know, he is a philosophy PhD, and he's been doing this for years. And the way he speaks, it's not like the way that ordinary people speak. And personally, the way that I speak and the way that I think, it has been transformed as a result of teaching this exam. And of course, you don't want to start doing LSAT logic in everyday life, you know, talking to friends and family and pointing out holes in their arguments. Believe me, I've learned from experience that nobody likes to hear that. So keep it focused on the LSAT specifically and keep it focused on when you get to law school. You could argue all day over there, but looking at this exam and looking to see just how deep the rabbit hole goes, the precision used in the language, it's amazing. I just love it. So anyway, again, like I said, we've talked about review, we talked about fluctuations. I want to talk a little bit about practice tests specifically. We talked about taking timed exams. I recommend, again, at least 10 in the lead up to test day before you walk in and take it. But a lot of students suffer from what I call the score inflation problem, where they take exams in unrealistic conditions. They give themselves extra time. They take bathroom breaks. They're eating snacks. They're checking their phones. That leads you to get inflated scores. Then you experience a test day drop. So the score inflation problem you want to avoid by properly simulating test day conditions. Strictly timed, 35 minutes. The only break you get is between sections 3 and 4. And once you're in practice test mode, nothing else gets in the way. Your phone is on airplane mode. Nobody else can interrupt you. And you're taking tests in conditions that are at least a little bit mildly distracting. So not in the sterile environment of your home or apartment or dorm room alone, nobody else around. You take one in the library, you take one in a coffee shop, you take one in the lobby somewhere where there's a little bit of ambient noise, a little bit of motion, because on test day, you're gonna have other people around you. You're gonna have the proctors. You may even have some noise from outside. Obviously, we hope and pray there won't be a marching band or a fire alarm. Those things do occasionally happen, and you wanna be ready for them mentally at least. But more things like the proctor circling around a little bit, or the person next to you sniffling or racing a little bit too vigorously. You want to know that you can do well in those kinds of conditions. Now, if you're doing 10 exams, you're going to have some fluctuations. Fluctuations are totally normal and to be expected because no one LSAT test form is identical to another. One might have a harder game section. One might have an easier reading count section, and one might play to your strengths. One doesn't. So you want to know that no one particular practice test represents your true ability. Instead, you want to apply what I call the law of averages. The law of averages is you take the most recent 5 exams you've done and you average them. And you take that as the best indication of where you stand. But no one single exam alone is perfectly representative. It's not a large enough sample because you might have been sick, you might have been tired, you might have been hungover. Again, it might not have played to your strengths. So if you take 5 of them that you've done relatively recently, those will be the best indication of where you stand, and they will help you predict how you will do on test day itself. But again, practice, test, and review, those are the end of the journey. You've got to build the foundation first. So use my study plans, use Laser. They are built on this foundation, and they share how to use my best LSAT prep resources. So I'm going to share with you a link to the schedules if you want to know more about them. Also, like I said, use my guides, cheat sheets, checklists, and explanations. Use my courses, the YouTube channel, the podcast, LSAT Unplugged, the Facebook community, the Instagram. All of those are resources available to you to help make your LSAT prep journey easier and help you avoid falling into some of the common traps that I personally fell into back when I was studying. Now I want to open it up to any questions you've had over the course of the evening, anything I've covered, anything LSAT prep, anything admissions. Feel free to ask more questions in the chat. I will go back one by one and address all the questions I missed. I know I didn't get to a lot of them, but I will start with those now. We've got one here asking, how early before graduating college should you start LSAT prep? And really, when to study for the LSAT, when to take it, it's whenever you're ready, whenever you are able to devote the time to studying for it. There's no one right answer on this. If you are currently a junior in college and you want to go directly from undergrad to law school, I would say take it this spring, take it this summer. Then you can apply at the beginning of the cycle in the fall when applications open. But for a lot of folks, summertime is great, especially if you're not working, you're not in school. You can devote more time to it over the summer or maybe over winter break. About a year from now, you take it in the winter, you study in the winter, then take it in January. That could work well too. But it's really whenever you personally have the time to devote to this exam. I recommend a minimum of 3 months to study for this exam, but typically it takes 5 to 6 months in order to reach your fullest potential on the LSAT. Other questions here. What's the most difficult type of LSAT question? It varies from person to person. It depends. No one right answer on that. I think a lot of folks have trouble with the more rare logic games, so-called curveball games that don't neatly fit into a defined category, like pattern, circle, mapping, the more unusual ones. In logical reasoning, folks typically have trouble with parallel questions. And then since a lot of pre-law students are more humanities, have more of a humanities background, they tend to find science passages in reading comprehension more difficult. But it varies from person to person, and it can all be mastered. Let's see, someone projected to graduate early at the age of 20. Should you go directly to law school or take a year off first? So should you take a gap year before going to law school? Law schools love to see when students take gap years because it means you're taking the time to really think through whether law school is right for you. You're not just going to law school as a default option, but don't do anything just for the purpose of admissions, including a gap year. If you want to do a gap year, that's great. If you have something fun in mind, like travel or a great job opportunity lined up, or you just aren't sure if law school is right for you, then yeah, take a gap year. But if you feel confident that law school is right for you, then go direct. How much prep time should you devote to preparing for the LSAT? So I talked about minimum 3 months, max 5, 6 to reach your fullest potential. But in terms of on a weekly basis, I recommend a minimum of 10 to 15 weeks to study for the exam. If you can do more, that's great. I probably wouldn't do more than 30 hours in a week because I don't want you to risk burnout, but anywhere between 10 and 30 hours I think is perfectly reasonable. Let's see, steps for improving reading comprehension. I'll start there. So tips for improving reading comprehension: read difficult, dense text of the type you'll see on the LSAT. You'll see a lot of folks recommending The Economist and Scientific American. And since the LSAT is digital now, at least in North America, I would recommend reading as much difficult, dense text as you can on a screen to get used to reading on a screen, because we're used to reading typically relatively lower quality information on a screen, like listicles and Facebook posts and such, when in reality, of course, LSAT's far more difficult. And of course, with nearly 100 released exams, you don't need to go beyond LSAT content to read difficult stuff. So I would just say read LSAT passages and try to engage with them and appreciate them and find them interesting. See what you could learn as a result of reading them. As for diagramming out logical reasoning questions, how important is that? I would say not very important. Most logical reasoning questions do not lend themselves to diagramming. Only a few question types would I recommend diagramming for, like sufficient assumption sometimes, parallel sometimes, must be true sometimes. Those are the only types where I would really ever recommend diagramming. For most of them, I would not. Most logical reasoning is informal in nature or more inductive, where you're really engaging with it in a more real world way, and diagramming won't help you much in those cases. Got a question: how long does it take to get your LSAT score back? It typically takes about 3 weeks. LSAC publishes score release dates for each administration, and they actually stick to those. It used to be that they would release them randomly a couple days early, which would stress people out a lot because you never knew when it was going to come. But now they're releasing on the day they say they will, projected, and it's typically about 3 weeks afterwards. Even though it's digital, it's not any faster, unfortunately, but hopefully in the future, it will be faster. I think that they could, at the very least, give you a raw score to show you a ballpark of where you stand, or give you a provisional score, subject to change a little bit depending on how they tabulate or tweak the curve, aka the curve or the raw score conversion. But for now, it's still about 3 weeks. Someone's asking, how much does actual legal experience relate to admissions? They love it. They love seeing that you have some exposure to the law, but it is not necessary. It's not required. It's nice to have, but I wouldn't go out and get legal work experience just for the purpose of applying to law school. Alternatively, if you think it would help you to see what legal practice is actually like, then you might find it valuable to go work as a paralegal or at least volunteer a little bit in some capacity to see what it's like and make a better decision about whether it's right for you. Someone's asking, is the writing sample required? Yes, it is. It is required. Does every single law school require it? I couldn't say, but they do want it. And if you're doing it for one school, you're really doing it for all of them. And you are really supposed to do the writing sample. So I recommend doing it. They want to see that you've completed it because it is part of the application. It's part of the LSAT, even though it's not on test day any longer. It's now digital. But it's a good way for you to show them your writing ability, especially if you are a non-native English speaker or if you didn't do well in any writing-related classes in college. You want to show law schools that you are a good writer, and you want to show them that you have that ability. And so I don't know why you wouldn't take the opportunity to show them that. And it doesn't require too much prep. And now that it's typed, they're more likely to look at it because they can actually read they can actually read what you're typing them. Previously, when it was handwritten, they typically couldn't make out what people had said. But now that it's typed, they will be more likely to actually look at them. And I've talked with admission officers at a few schools, and they are looking at them more often now as a result. Someone's asking, does the LSAT have an expiration date? Yes, they do, but it's about 5 years. The score reports are valid for 5 years. And so if you're taking it now and you're applying in a year or two, no concerns at all. You could certainly still apply with that particular score. Someone's asking what the LSAT costs. It's about $200 to take the LSAT. The cost has been rising a lot in recent years, and I don't see it going down anytime soon, but even if you're thinking of retaking, I would not consider the cost a barrier because it's worth retaking. Like I said, the value of a single point more is about $4,000. So to spend $200 to take it again, to potentially improve a couple of points at least, it's well worth it. I would definitely recommend retaking and wouldn't let the cost be a barrier. And if you suffer financial hardship, you could apply for a fee waiver and get a couple of LSATs for free. So that would be nice. Someone's asking how many times you can take the LSAT. There are new retake limits that started last year. You can now take the LSAT only 3 times in one cycle, and cycles run from June to May of the following year. You could take it 5 times in 5 years and 7 times for life. And once you get a 180, you cannot retake it again. But those retake limits are not that strict and they won't affect that many students. I don't love that they have these retake limits, but they are what they are. And you can avoid hitting them relatively easily. So you could take the LSAT in April, then take it again in June. And because those are 2 different admission cycles, that would not be part of the 3 in 1 cycle. Someone's asking, how many times can you postpone the LSAT? As far as I know, there is no limit on that because if you postpone or if you withdraw, it does not count as a take on your record. And law schools actually won't even know that you were registered for that particular test date. So I wouldn't worry about postponing or withdrawing. Of course, it costs you money. LSAC will not give you a full refund on any test that once you registered for it, but that's the deal. You know, you want to take the LSAT only when you're ready, but you also want to register in advance to make sure that you can actually get a test center and find one that's conveniently located. You don't want to have to travel far to take the LSAT, and you don't want to get closed out at any particular test center. So it's worth registering once you know that you are likely to take a certain test, and if you have to withdraw or postpone, so be it. It's part of the cost of taking this exam and applying to law school. As for the GRE, I don't consider it a huge factor in the law school admission process. Of course, some schools are taking the GRE more than ever before, but if you really want to show that you're serious about law school, the LSAT is the main game in town, and fewer than 5% of applicants are typically getting admitted with GRE scores. And law schools, they want to know that you're serious. They want to know that you're going to do well in law school, and the LSAT has a stronger demonstrated correlation with first-year law school grades, at least in my opinion, than the GRE does. And so the GRE, or the Graduate Record Examination, it's an exam that I think is more likely to work better for STEM students or those who have really strong applications anyway. And law schools, of course, are taking GRE scores in order to solicit more applicants because they're struggling these days with fewer people applying to law school than in previous years, and they want to get as many applications as possible to not only increase their application fee income, but also to have a wider selection of applicants to choose from to pick the best students possible. But I wouldn't recommend the GRE for most folks. I would say take the LSAT. Let's see other questions here. How possible or likely or doable is it to increase your score by 10 to 15 points? I think it's very doable. I've seen plenty of increases on that level and beyond. And I have their stories cataloged in what I call LSAT diaries. I'll actually share the link with you here. It's the stories submitted by former students sharing their law school admissions and LSAT journeys in particular. And you'll see many of them improve by 20 points or more, especially if you haven't started studying yet or you haven't built that foundation yet. There's plenty of room to increase from there. And so I would certainly recommend looking at the LSAT diaries and trusting that with the right prep, with the right amount of time devoted to this, you can master this exam. Like I said, the average student taking a prep course improves 10 to 11 points at least. Personally, I improved 23 points, and I've seen many students improve 23 points or more. And of course, the lower you start, the more that you can improve. But I've seen plenty of folks go from the 130s to the 150s, the 140s to the 160s, and beyond. But like I said, you gotta put in the work. You gotta make use of the best resources available and then devote yourself to this process fully. Like I said, it takes typically 5 to 6 months to reach your fullest potential on this exam at a minimum of 3 months. But the more you put in, the more you'll get out. Simple as that. What is my take on personal LSAT coaching? I think it can be enormously beneficial, of course. I'm an LSAT coach. I've seen the results my students get from putting in the time to master this exam. As a coach, I help you see your blind spots. I help you figure out more efficient approaches, but I can only pave the way for you. It's up to you to actually put in the work and make it happen. So typically for 1 hour of coaching with me, I'll require my students to spend at least 10 hours on their own putting in the work, and typically more than that. The students who put in the most work tend to get the most results. It's really as simple as that. I don't have too much more to say on it, but I will say that what I do for my students is I force you to engage in the process that I recommended here, especially that Socratic review method. I force my students to actually articulate their thought processes, to write out the tempting wrong answers, the discouraging right answers, to get inside their own heads, as well as the minds of the test makers, to see what tricks and traps they were falling for. And a lot of folks, they'll kind of haphazardly do it or only do it halfway. And I'll critique their review processes and help them figure out more efficient approaches to better master the material and to also craft personalized day-by-day study plans. Because of course I have general plans that I shared with you, but they don't focus on your weak areas because every student has a different area of strength and weakness. You also have to allow room for adaptation along the way. And so I will craft for them a study plan that changes as they move forward in their prep processes. So I'll say, this week you're doing this, we'll look at what you did the previous week, and now we'll look ahead to the next week. And we'll allow room for adaptation and adjustments along the way. Because no one pre-prescribed approach works for every student. So I'll help them customize something more unique to their situation. I'll tailor-make a specific plan for them. And I recommend crafting your own plan as well. My study plans are simply a general framework involving laser, but you might be better at games and worse at reading count, or vice versa. So you might want to adjust the plan to allow more room to focus on your specific weak area. As for numbers, I'll get students asking me to chance them or predict their odds at a particular school given X GPA or Y LSAT score. And of course, if you're not done with the LSAT, any score that you have is only theoretical or hypothetical, and any discussion of chances is really meaningless. There are plenty of calculators out there where you input your LSAT score and your GPA, and it will give you a particular result showing you how you stack up at different schools. LSAC has one, and so if you just Google LSAC GPA calculator, you will find LSAC's tool where you can input your own numbers and see how you would play out at a variety of different schools. So definitely play around with that, but don't obsess too much over it. Basically, your GPA is what it is. If you're still in college, you may be able to retake a class, or you may be able to boost your GPA a little bit. And if your GPA is low and you're still in school, if you're a senior, you may want to wait until you fully finished out the year to then apply with a higher GPA if you're able to demonstrate an upward trend. And then, of course, you'll apply with better numbers. And if you haven't taken the LSAT yet, or you're planning to retake, then once again, once you have that final number, you'll be able to better evaluate yourself. But I always say, shoot for the moon, get the highest score possible. There's no reason not to shoot for a 180 if you're willing to put in the time. So focus on that, then get to the numbers later. Anyway, folks, been going for a while here now. I may not have gotten to all of your questions, but please feel free to reach out, and I will do my best to get to them in the future over email or DM. Feel free to reach out to me. You all asked great questions tonight, and I really appreciate all of you for showing up here and spending your time with me on this LSAT discussion. If you need anything going forward, again, please feel free to reach out through the LSAT blog, the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast as well. I'm here for you folks. Have a good night, everyone, and thanks for joining. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.